this is an adapted presentation of one that I've given a few times over the past year or two to our sort of clinical partners at the University of Botswana and some of the other Penn global health partnerships in sub-Saharan Africa. So you'll see it has that a little bit of an emphasis towards the health sciences and also a little bit of an emphasis on resources for people from that region. But more and more the awareness of predatory publication has spread into different disciplines. So again, while this is largely focused on the health sciences because STEM has been the epicenter of the predatory publishing quote unquote problem for the last half a decade or more, it is a recognized issue in other disciplines too. So I hope that even if you don't experience the specific issue of predatory publishing, where you do your work, there are also some suggestions in here about just in general how to identify sources that you may want to publish, methods for appraising unfamiliar sources, and some other hopefully helpful skills that will contribute to your knowledge. So just a quick about me. Won't dwell on this too much, but I'm Richard James. I'm the liaison librarian to the School of Nursing and the liaison librarian to the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy. I've been around in sort of this and similar positions for more than a decade. I'm particularly interested in open access topics because I have some long-standing extracurricular or semi-curricular engagements in healthcare advocacy and patient-centered care, including engagement of patients in research oversight, quality improvement. And open access goes hand in hand with those efforts in some really useful ways. So at the bottom, I am going to have sort of somewhat of a disclosure. I am an associate editor for the Directory of Open Access Journals, where I do sort of quality appraisal and application review. I am going to talk, a good little bit about the Directory of Open Access Journals, but that's a project that I'm involved with. So if you haven't received a solicitation like this in your email, you will. And you will receive this solicitation very soon after you've published your first peer-reviewed journal article. As soon as something that you publish appears in a journal, appears in a database, is sort of acquirable in Google Scholar, you'll start to see invitations like this, and they all sort of start in the same way. Dear some version of your name that may or may not be semi-accurate with a title that you may or may not have. Can you contribute content or expertise to this journal you've never heard of in a field that you may never have any engagement with? Because this is, sort of from the classic playbook of sort of old-fashioned mass mailing in postal services, like publishing clearinghouse. You can send, in fact, the economics are probably much better than, physical mass mail, because, you could always send out 10 million pieces of mail. And I have a little bit of history in this because one of my earlier library jobs was as a processing archivist for a business history library, and we worked really extensively in the archives of the MCI Communications Corporation / WorldCom, which was a telecommunications company of some infamy and renown in the 90s, and they were a big player in mass mailing to sort of generate subscribers. But you're all familiar with this, and you always wonder, like, how is it possible? How can you send out all of these emails for something I'm clearly uninterested in? Like, how can that be a business model? But it is, because when you think about the economies of scale in postal and email, if you send this sort of merged email out to 1 million people, if one person responds, that's really like made it worthwhile. You know, if you get a handful of articles, if you get, you know, a couple of people who, you know, indicate that they're willing to become part of your editorial board and lend their credibility to your new entity, that's sufficient, right? So you see these, and many faculty academics have got strategies in their email to just sort of move things that look like this directly over to junk, which, you know, there are problems to that I'll talk about, but, you know, you'll all experience this. And this is very typical. Again, you know, your title may be inaccurate. You may never have heard of the field, probably have never heard of the journal. They will make some kind of claims to their availability. And you can see here, it's in the 1, 2, 3, 4th paragraph. The journal will be published with the assistance of a publisher who may or may not be familiar. This publisher is a member of certain organizations. Their content is indexed by some things that may or may not be familiar to you. None of these things, you know, all of these things really need to be evaluated. You know, these are all claims. They may be false, they may be true. I think that being indexed in Google Scholar is not really sort of a tremendous accomplishment. I haven't heard of many of these, but this is typical, like throwing a lot of information at you to build sort of a rhetorically credible case for your participation in their journal. And again, it comes out, Dr. Caccione is a very senior member of the nursing faculty, and she got this a couple of years ago, and you know, they're unfamiliar. They borderline often seem credible. We have raised certain red flags against, you know, either responding or rejecting these out of hand over the years. New journals appear. New journals need to be out there soliciting articles and soliciting interest. And there are very few ways of doing that enable sort of upstarts to challenge the kind of the established hegemony of academic publishing. And so, you know, some of these journals are in a sort of a heads you win, tails you lose kind of situation, because the strategies that a new player needs to establish itself in a very sort of ruthlessly competitive and, you know, very sort of strongly integrated academic publishing market are very sort of challenging and overwhelming. You know, there need to be new journals. There need to be open access journals. There's strong cases for, you know, why scholars and academics should support these, but there's a very sort of challenging context of identifying which ones, you know, you should support. So I'm going to sort of try and unpack a few things over the next 40 minutes or so along those lines. But a quick sort of primer on open access, because all of these predatory, quote unquote, predatory publications make a claim to be open access. They usually are open access. I mean, they're not really. They're openly available online. You know, open access is a little bit more of a complicated concept, but you know, open access, many sort of serious declarations about what that means, and sort of consensus agreements on you know, what open access stands for: the immediate online free availability of research outputs without restrictions such as subscription, such as kind of paywall, differentiated here from self-publishing and vanity publishing, because the expectation still is there'll be a quality framework that may be guided by peer review models and selectivity, you know, and while some people sort of conflate the open access concept with free, it is not, you know, generally or sort of very often free to the publisher. The goal of open access is for research outputs to be free to be consumed in various ways by stakeholders. And again, as coming from the perspective of sort of patient and family advocacy in healthcare, knocking down sort of barriers to, you know, consumption and awareness and dissemination of research outputs between sort of the, you know, the people who are at the tip of that, you know, the people who are receiving that or are going to be subject to the sort of the findings of research. Open access is really important in this community because, we want to know, it's that kind of, nothing about us without us concept. We want to know what is being talked about, what is being practiced, what is being, promoted in healthcare, because as the recipients of that care, we claim kind of a right to that. There's that kind of, that ethical space of open access. There's also, for the producers of research, a practical advantage in many ways. It does bring greater visibility and impact. There's a very kind of well-established open access citation advantage, which is sort of intuitively, you would think it makes sense. If your research outputs are very easy to find, very easy to acquire, there's no barriers to sort of another user reading, repurposing, or reusing, then that would intuitively be represented in increased citations. And it has been. There is the claim that in healthcare, it may help to reduce that sort of 17-year barrier from sort of publication to practice that is a problem in implementation, and making that material available in different sort of consumable forms without limits or restrictions enables other types of research to happen on it, that you're producing your data sets, that you're making those widely available, that text mining can happen in larger sort of corpuses. So open access does enable the creation of new knowledge and, levels the playing field. Again, this is in its origin, a presentation for some of our sub-Saharan African partners, who have to manage severe limitations in access to research literature. The models that they have, the budgets that they have are very restrictive. There are a lot of difficulties. Open access is one of the ways in which we can shift the burden of production, shift the burden to producers rather than consumers. And that's, helpful for broad classes of people in all different parts of the world. So the case for open access is pretty well established, and it's been sort of had this tremendous trajectory, over this during this century. Again, it's sort of post 2000 phenomenon, and this tremendous increase in open access publications is in part driven by requirements of research funders. These models have been accommodated, insisted upon. There are plans in Europe to make it sort of somewhat mandatory for funded research for many organizations. Little less so in the United States, but still there are significant research funders who do require and support open access availability at the point of publication, which is a little bit beyond what the National Institutes of Health require, which is kind of the allowance of an embargo. So there are these sort of, conflicting and corresponding models, but there's the research funding requirements have contributed to this steep curve. There's the increasingly sort of inexpensive infrastructure of publishing, but also this huge increase in the number of researchers and scholars who are seeking to publish, who are seeking to disseminate their work in kind of significant sources. And then the increased awareness of the importance of providing access globally beyond the confines of academia. On the other hand, those two things that are highlighted are what has enabled this sort of so-called predatory publishing market to emerge. It's very cheap to establish an online journal. There are tremendous pressures within academic culture to publish overall, and a vastly increased number of people who are seeking to publish, which has made sort of established journals able to be increasingly selective. And so there's, while there have been a correspondingly large increase in the amount of titles that the recognized publishers have put out, there's also this pressure. And so, this is what has enabled these publishers to seize control of a pretty lucrative market. Now, again, I'll talk about Beall's list a little bit, but Beall's list is a concept that you may or may not have heard of. So a list that you may or may not have heard of, an actual physical list that was around online to about sort of 2018, that was the product of one scholarly communications librarian at the University of Colorado who generated a certain amount of controversy with his criteria, loosely defined, somewhat arbitrary criteria for identifying publishers, which seemed to create, a generalized suspicion of open access journals in general, and particularly open access journals from the global south that were in sort of emergent into the market, because some of his criteria were, A, sort of Anglo-centric as far as, skill in writing is concerned. B, well, I'll stay away from a sort of a long form pan of the Beall's list, but again, it's not really sort of felt to be credible now. But did have a lot of impact in sort of moving this debate forward, and engendering a lot of research and inquiry into the scope of the problem. And so even if you take the Beall's list publishers at face value, which is like 8,000, producing 8,000, many more now. In 2015, 8,000 active publishing journals, all of which are charging some amount of money to authors to be published in those journals. That it was a $75 million market in 2015, more so now. And the vast majority of that $75 million was being taken from researchers in Asia and Africa. So 75% of 75 million. Those are a significant amount of money in areas that are to some extent constrained for those kind of resources. So the concern that the quality of those journals and the permanency of those journals was questionable is is a question that is really felt by some of our sort of partners in sub-Saharan Africa and other regions. The bigger problem was that, largely thanks to Beall painting open access with this sort of very sort of broad, somewhat colonialist brush, that those open access journals caused open access generally as a concept to be regarded with suspicion or thought to be poorer or lesser quality. And these are things that I hear today from people, largely at Penn and various constituencies, that they're suspicious of open access because they conflate it with predatory, and that's there are significant points of difference between those two concepts. But certainly over the past few years, there's a higher level of awareness of low quality, so-called predatory publications. This is a Nature article from a couple of years ago, again, showing how, in this case, the problem isn't, geographically contained, that, researchers are, quote unquote, duped into submitting to predatory journals in which their work can be overlooked. And this is kind of the significant part of the argument, that again, this is, I think, 2018, this is an NIH sort of directive, sort of alerting people to be sort of more considerate about where they submit, that they have a few bullet points here to sort of help you identify the attributes of low quality or predatory publishing, or how to differentiate them from reputable journals. The lack of transparency about article processing charges, which can cause people to have their work hijacked, and really sort of have those article processing charges extorted out of them. Failure to disclose that information. I'll talk about this with the Directory of Open Access Journals process, and how we go about evaluating titles. Aggressive, quote unquote aggressive. I don't really know what does aggressive mean in this context. I don't know. It's like, I get a lot of emails from predatory publishers. Like, I don't know whether that's aggressive or non-aggressive, or just trying to claim market share. But these inaccurate statements about editorial board membership, or misleading statements about the process and the indexing, those are all the sort of the classic red flags, right? NIH has these recommendations, which are kind of sort of squishy. I don't really know if they're sort of particularly helpful. It sort of seems to kind of end up saying, like, do better, right? I don't know how you sort of operationalize those recommendations, but I'll give some sort of suggestions and tools about that going forward. They're sort of, and again, this is a nice the Committee on Publication Ethics. Again, I think this is 2019 or 2020, like relatively recently. This was their draft definition of predatory publishing, right? So probably the most recent, and I think one of the better, simpler definitions, which really translates easily into kind of the things to watch out for concept. So cheating and deceiving some authors, because there's like established recognition that some authors submit to these journals in the full knowledge of their sort of strengths and deficits, partly because maybe they just want to get an article into something, right? Again, this is one of those concepts that has been particularly sort of felt in some of in Nigeria, for instance, in Pakistan, where there were had been a lot of incentives to publish, and authors and researchers would be sort of compensated or credited for publications, without a lot of consideration about where those publications occurred. You can easily find a lot of discussion about that in the news. There's publication mills, sort of similar problem in some countries. And there were, sort of good incentives for a lot of scholars to submit at relatively low costs, particularly like low costs coming out of their research budgets, to some of these poor quality journals, because it was checked off as a publication, and that was fine. Now, many sort of countries have, and again, this is like somewhat unfortunate, have cracked down on those incentives by requiring, like Nigeria has kind of a list of journals for the sort of the central kind of grant funding agencies and sort of the agencies that oversee higher education. Again, Pakistan, similarly, India have produced these kind of master lists of eligible publications, right? Again, the downside of that is it kind of reinforces the sort of the big publisher monopoly, and it also provides a significant barrier to emergent journals emerging. If you're a scholar in one of those countries, you are not going to publish in a journal that is not on the list, because you're not going to get any sort of any credit for that. So again, all of these things are somewhat emergent and in flux and changing, and need to keep an eye on. But the COPE definition, I think, has served pretty well for giving you some points to look into when you're evaluating a new journal. So, and again, I've always thought this was a amusing comparison. The claims that are often levied against predatory publishing, they may charge excessive fees with little transparency. Well, so does Biomed Central, like so does Elsevier, so do all of the reputable publishers, and so do all of the reputable open access models. So again, like Elsevier's open access fees are way more excessive than any so-called predatory publication, which may charge like $200, $300. BMC Elsevier maybe like $2,000, $2,500. Again, like this classic sort of Beale list flag of a predatory publication may send out unsolicited requests for submissions. Well, again, like how is a new publication supposed to get off the ground, right? That's a business model that they need to do. And, it's been my concern that saying that these are like absolute sort of categorical no-nos is a big problem. Rarely will they be included in reputable indexes or databases, in PubMed, in Scopus, in any of the sources that you might go to derive an impact factor or any other sort of index of credibility. That is probably the one that's most true. Promise peer review and approval within 24 hours, anything that if you've ever been involved in academic publishing would seem like a dream come true. But no reputable journal is turning around a meaningful peer review process and approval in a week. I mean, it's just like, it doesn't seem like it's an actual possibility. And so, anybody who claims that, if it sounds too good to be true, etc. And again, you may have concerns about the quality of the, sort of the homepage content, either that, in many cases, you see a description of scope that either seems kind of bizarre in that it conflates many different disciplines into like a journal of, CRISPR and knitting, right? I mean, sort of, if you saw that, you'd be like, that's odd. But, extreme example, but, you do see these kind of journals that have multiple domains of the things that they publish about. And, that seems like it's something that should be a red flag. For a journal to be a generalist journal beyond a specific kind of discipline is unusual. And again, like have content on their homepage that seems poorly written, that seems like it's cut and pasted, that's lacking in quality. But again, with the knowledge that many of these journals are being sort of generated and developed and published from countries where English is not necessarily the first language of the editors, it seems sort of unfair and somewhat discriminatory to use that as a as a very specific red flag. Now, I have seen scopes of journal statements that are literally cut and pasted from Wikipedia, like, I don't have the slide on this one, but like a biochemistry, predatory biochemical journal where it said, biochemistry, the scope of this journal is to publish articles on, and then it just had the Wikipedia definition of biochemistry. Again, that is a red flag, and that's fine. I mean, I think that's, plagiarizing from Wikipedia as the actual journal. We wouldn't want scholars to do that, and we probably should not want journal editors to do that. So, there are a bunch of red flag kind of models that have emerged that are not as kind of cut and dried as the old sort of Beale's list protocol, which do sort of take into account, some of these concerns that I've raised, but also do sort of shift, everybody loves a list, everybody loves a checklist. Checklists are great. You can say like, oh, is this thing on this list? Boom, like yes or no, decision made. The sort of the complexity of the concept and the sort of the difficulties of establishing whether something is predatory or not predatory does shift the burden of discernment onto the author, and like that's not like a bad thing, but it's another thing, right? Another thing to do. Ways, things you have to look for, Google searches you have to check, things you have to cross-reference against credible sources. You can see some of those here. They say they're a member of X or Y organization. Go to that organization and see, are they a member of X or Y, right? They say the editor in these editors belong to this institution. Do they? There's a lot of kind of articles that you may have seen in the past few years about sort of sting operations on predatory publishing. And it's fine. I mean, but it's not really sort of generating new knowledge. It's like, I don't know what is added to sort of the dialogue by saying like, oh, look, this predatory publication has like a dog on its editorial board. Right. Nobody was ever saying they were like credible. And there are, in fact, examples of like imaginary people or, photographs from that website that creates that website that creates people who don't exist. I can't remember the name of it. It's really interesting. It just sort of goes through Google images of people to sort of generate unique faces that aren't supposedly anybody. Those images have been seen as sort of author bios on some of these journals, along with kind of specious or imaginary or just frankly made up profiles. So, doing this sort of cross-checking and cross-referencing is difficult. I mean, not difficult, but it's time-consuming. It's like another task. And it sort of leads people to be like, well, I'm not going to bother. Like this category of journals who look like this are other, not credible. I'm going to ignore them. And there are problems that go along with that. Many of the sort of the big publishers and the organizations sort of cope, some other sort of open access organizations came together to develop this think, check, submit rubric, which again is just sort of a pathway for authors to say, be discerning, like look at these areas, evaluate these claims, kind of look into the, these areas, these things that the journal is saying. If they're true, if you can prove them, then it's fine, right? You need to be confident. And this is a self-serving thing in the most part, because again, we're concerned, and there's plenty of evidence that authors, make choices about where to submit to, and then, lose control of the article, which is not unusual, right? I mean, you lose control of an article when you submit to a publisher of any level of credibility. If you're giving up your publication rights. What is sort of a classic story in predatory publishing is somebody submitting an article to a journal, clicking through all of the agreements, without reading them, transferring the copyright to the publisher, and then seeing the kind of like, oh, by the way, there's like a processing charge of $400. And then, you're in a hostage situation with your article. And there's plenty of sad examples of people getting to that point and having to walk away. And again, feeling like they should not publish the article. Now, again, I question that kind of decision, like, oh, I transferred the copyright to, a predatory publishing, it's lost. Many people sort of apply the kind of the standard rules that like, well, I did that, I'm on the hook for that, that particular research output, that was a waste of time. I can't publish that anywhere else. Again, questionable about that. I would defer to counsel on that one. But that's kind of the situation that, you can't come up with the money. They're not going to give you your article back. They may go ahead and publish it anyway, but it's not going to do you any good. I mean, if you do pay, you're being published in these sources that are, not contributing to metrics. And again, like questionable concept, but it is the truth that, you know, in many sort of scholarly communities, having that sort of indexing, archiving, discoverability, counting of a journal is a value that contributes to success. And you know, you don't get any of that either with these sources. I'll skip it. That's very nursing specific. But any questions so far about kind of like, oh, and of course the offer that I make here is that, you know, your librarians will help with evaluating the credibility of a journal. I mean, again, as sort of the function of the university and the library, where, you know, that's part of many people's sort of overall responsibilities as sort of bibliographers and purchasers, is to see whether something is worth buying. You know, we can transfer that process into kind of your individual sort of author needs, like, is this journal worth publishing in? And, you know, like I do this semi-frequently within the School of Nursing, that people will send me one of these solicitations and be, you know, like, is this worth pursuing? And, you know, my responses are, I don't sort of say like yes or no, because I don't know what the author's interests are specifically. But, you know, I will say like, oh, you know, this is a journal that has content that is indexed in some major databases, right? There is, you know, an author processing charge that you may not be aware of. You know, we do see reports of this publisher as being identified as a predatory publishing. And so then, and often one of the things I'll say is in a kind of a, you know, on the plus side, oh, this journal is in the directory of open access journals, which is pretty well regarded as sort of the most significant sort of multidisciplinary, you know, index of open access journals that has kind of a strong sort of credibility threshold. You know, you do have to apply, you do have to be evaluated. It's pretty rigorous, and you know, it's fair, I think, fair to claim that a journal that is listed in the directory of open access journal is something that it is fine to publish in. And again, these journals may charge fees. It's not kind of disqualifying in DOAJ to charge fees. There has to be a business model for open access. You know, there are some these diamond open access journals that have, you know, sort of their hands in the Gates Foundation pockets or the Wellcome Foundation or other sort of big funders. There aren't many of those. Most open access journals are sort of these shoestring operations from university departments and other organizations that are, you know, trying to provide channels for their research and their research communities. So I'll talk a little bit now about, you know, for 5 minutes about DOAJ. I've been an associate editor of the Directory of Open Access Journals for like 5 or 6 years now. Again, you know, we claim to be the leading sort of source for finding high quality peer-reviewed open access research journals in many disciplines. So again, this is not like primarily a STEM thing, although, you know, open access is, you know, has been bigger in STEM than in some other disciplines. Again, you know, to some extent, DOAJ was initiated as a project to support publishing in the global South. So you do see like a tremendous amount of content from, you know, outside sort of the Anglosphere. And we don't use the label predatory publishing, which is sort of why I've been sort of air quoting it often throughout the presentation. You know, so we believe there are best practices in open access publishing. We believe we know what they are. We believe our job is to sort of encourage them. And, you know, if publishers won't sort of meet best practices, then, you know, that's a choice that they make, and we won't include them in our indexes, and they can do what they want. But part of our role is, you know, some of this is very complicated. You know, best practices in open access is a pretty complicated field, and many publishers declare themselves to be an open access publication because the content is available. And that's a good faith claim. It's not really sort of accurate in the sort of the, quote unquote, official definitions of what open access means in publishing, but they're not deceiving anybody. There's kind of a knowledge gap. DOAJ wants to sort of work with publishers to improve that transparency, the services to authors, and just this promoting sort of publishing literacy about open access is one of our sort of strong goals. So, this is not like, this is just a visual. This is our process for kind of evaluating applications. The journal editors apply to be listed, and they go around this sort of merry-go-round for a while. As an editor, I'm assigned applications, and then I sort of go through them step by step to sort of prove and evaluate that all of the claims are accurate, that they're indexed where they say they're indexed, that their editorial board are the people they say. Now, again, predatory publishers probably don't bother to take the time to sort of apply to be listed in DOAJ. I don't know what their incentive would be, because they know who they are, right? So, this largely sort of works to sort of shape up and improve content from publishers who are like, trying to be their best. But, we do feel, and there's even like, you can be listed with kind of like a gold seal. There's kind of a few different sort of standards. We do sort of feel that like a first place to check, and I think librarians generally feel that a good first place to check is a journal listed in DOAJ. If it is, then you don't really need to sort of pursue any further deciding whether it's credible or not. I mean, it is, right? It's been listed, it has content, it has a history. The claims that are made by the editorials are, largely true, and it meets kind of a floor of credibility. And so, I'd always encourage people to do that. And I'll just skip over. The next few slides are, sort of oriented specifically at sort of our African partners. There are, other sort of regional best open access repositories. Like DOAJ is global, but there's Agile African Journals Online, which has a sort of substantial crossover of titles with DOAJ, but is exclusively for for journals that are published in sub-Saharan Africa. But they also have a very stringent criteria of quality improvement. Again, if a journal is listed on Agile, if it's listed, there's a Central American, whose name I knew like a second ago, but just slipped my mind. There's a sort of Central and Southern American repository of open access journals. There are a number of like area repositories of open access journals, all of which are, sort of also meeting pretty stringent quality criteria. So there's a bunch of places that you can look if you're evaluating the journal. And again, I hope that your librarian will do that looking for you. Again, this is for a resource for researchers from the global South, but AuthorAid is sort of a global support network for researchers, which includes sort of like a lot of really helpful bulletin boards. There are a lot of conversations, in their forums about identifying journals. It can be a helpful place to search, to look for, look for information about a particular unfamiliar journal. I also go there sometimes to do that. But AuthorAid has also got like all these wraparound services that are, supported by some sort of major partners in Britain and Europe, to make sure that their work can continue. That one. All right. So this is the kind of the summary slide, I think. Yeah. Again, like reach out. If you have questions, reach out to the librarian. Make sure that there's explicit sort of documentation about whether there are going to be fees or not. There usually are, but charging fees is not a sign of being a predatory publication. Charging fees is a sign that, your journal has a business model that is not subscription based. Nothing, these are not free, right? Again, legitimate journals will be pretty like as transparent as possible about what the process is, who the work goes to, when you should expect kind of responses. And, my sort of advice is, what contributes to some of these decisions to publish in questionable journals is academic pressure. Again, like, it's important to sort of be as objective as possible when making decisions about where to submit. And if you have to sort of farm that objectivity out to librarians or peers or colleagues or your networks, then that can be a good way of doing it. But, that need to get something off your desk and into a journal is very real, and, can sort of bias, decisions that you might have made otherwise. And again, like your networks that you're in should be supportive of like helping you, make some of these decisions. But, we have a sort of a blind faith trust in kind of like the journals we've heard of. You do have to bring that higher level of critical appraisal to unfamiliar sources. That's just like good practice in life and information in general. And there are those rubrics such as think, check, submit to sort of guide you through that process. And there are the reputable, trusted sources for giving you sort of the business information, about a title. And again, I'm certainly always happy to investigate journals on behalf of researchers or students or faculty at Penn. I do that a fair amount with my community, and I hope that your librarian will do the same for you.